Welcome to the Translations Colloquium, Center for Research and Innovation in Translations and Translation Technology, CRITT, at Kent State University. My name is Susi Rahmawati. I will be moderating the talk today. Before we start, I would like to remind you that the format of the talk is like a conference presentation. We will have about an hour, and our guest speaker will give presentation uninterruptedly, and afterwards we will have questions and answer sessions. This morning we have the pleasure to welcome a distinguished guest speaker, Daniel Gile. Daniel Gile first studied mathematics and sociology as a minor for his first degree. He later migrated to technical translations and conference interpreting and started studying Japanese. He rapidly became interested in research and earned a PhD degree in Japanese, then a PhD in linguistics, and then a postdoctoral degree, habilitation, all related to translations and interpreting. He has lectured, published extensively, and is a member of many editorial and consultative boards, a former CIRA professor and current CIRA staff member, and a co-founder of the European Society for Translation Studies and its third president, the founder of the Syrian Network and the editor of the Syrian Bulletin. His research interests include translator and interpreter training, interpreting cognitions, and the training of researchers in translations and interpreting studies. So the title of his presentation today is Cognitive Load and Effort in Translations and Interpreting, Methodological Issues. He will explain the construct of cognitive load and its methodological framework that ensure the distinction between cognitive load and cognitive efforts measures, which involve triangulations of several indicators and retrospective verbal indicators. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to present to you Daniel Gile. Dr. Gile, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susie. Okay, let's go. I should like to start by explaining how I got interested in this very issue of cognitive load. While observing interpreting, including introspection, but also observing students and observing colleagues, I found that there are many errors, omissions, and infelicities, what I call EOIs, that were clearly not due to lack of declarative knowledge in the interpreters. I started reading the relevant literature, in particular cognitive science literature, and developed in the early 1980s a number of models, starting with a hypothesis, according to which we use when interpreting some kind of processing capacity, what I call mental energy in the beginning. Then I developed the effort models for interpreting with an additional tightrope hypothesis that says that we tend to work close to the capacity of the attention that we have, and a model of language availability. So to me, this intuitive idea of cognitive load was a very strong, a very powerful explanation for interpreting performance, or at least a promising factor. I don't know about translation. I see that lots of people are interested in cognitive load in translation, written translation, but I'm not exactly sure why, and we'll get back to that a bit later. Just a question, can you hear me? Is this okay, the sound?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, fine. So the construct of cognitive load. In the literature, that is in the literature of psychology, you have cognitive load theory, which was developed by Swelter in the late 1980s. It is based on a construct, another theory, the construct of working memory, which has limitations, both in terms of executive functions and in terms of storage capacity. Another point is that some operations, and not just mental operations, not just cognitive operations, but physical operations, require attentional resources that working memory is supposed to offer. They are referred to as non-automatic operations by psychologists, and they are opposed to automatic operations which do not require such resources. And cognitive load, according to cognitive load theory, was defined by the proportion of the resources that is required to perform a task. My questions right away is, how can you quantify the resources? Can you? And how do you measure this proportion? I have found no answer to that. And then cognitive load theory defines intrinsic load, which is specific to a task. And I quote, the inherent complexity or difficulty involved in certain tasks or material. But, and psychologists who follow the cognitive load theory acknowledge that for the same task, the cognitive load it represents for an individual can be higher or lower depending on a number of factors, such as the individual's pre-existing knowledge, such as the individual's cognitive skills, such as the individual's state of fatigue at a given time. So for the same task, I will spare you the mathematical formulation. So for the same task, it says the same thing. For the same task, the same individual might feel a different cognitive load. So it cannot be really intrinsic in absolute terms. And also, different individuals may experience different loads. So I'm not sure what intrinsic load means. Perhaps it means something that is context dependent and person dependent, in which case it makes sense, but otherwise I have many questions. But the main point is that the task will not necessarily require or elicit the same effort at all time and for all individuals. Now, in interpreting, and all of this I'm doing rather fast because I think it should be familiar to you. It is just a reminder and the way I see things. If there is a misperception, it will be an opportunity for you to correct me. Some exchanges in utterance can be interpreted without effort, at least for professionals. It's not necessarily the case for beginners or for students. Other utterances that need to be interpreted are perceived as requiring some effort. For instance, I'm just giving a few examples. Sentences with complex structures, sentences that include words with a low frequency in language, speakers who are non-native. In sign language interpreting, when you have to read finger spelling, which is a certain form of signing where you actually spell very rapidly with the hands, with the fingers, you spell the way the word or the name is written in the relevant national language. When lexical gaps occur, as you may know, as you probably know, sign languages have a very small vocabulary or a very small standard vocabulary as opposed to spoken languages. So it happens very, very often that for a given term, a given word, a noun, a verb, an adjective, etc., in spoken language, there is no equivalent standard sign. So interpreters, sign language interpreters, have to make an effort and try to express the same idea differently. And when they interpret signers who use non-standard signing, which is equivalent to, or more or less, I suppose, to speakers using their non-native language. I think that Michaela has devoted a lot of time and a lot of reflection to the question of English as a lingua franca. So this is more or less the equivalent. And more generally, there are problem triggers, so-called problem triggers. This is the term, which are very well known in the interpreting community and among researchers. Plus, some effort is required to resist interference from another language. For instance, if you speak into a target language, to resist interference from the source language. And there are stressful situations as well, when there are high stakes, when you know that they're being watched, when you know that you're being judged, etc., etc. So there are various sources of effort, cognitive effort, actually, while interpreting. Now, what happens when cognitive load, and I still use the term in an intuitive sense, when the cognitive pressure is too high? Well, what happens in terms of output performance, what I will later refer to as output quality, is that you find errors, omissions, and infelicities. Infelicities are suboptimal formulations which do not quite reach the degree of incorrectness that would make them errors. And this happens in two ways. Either there is direct cognitive saturation, in other words, attentional resources, say the working memory is saturated and you just cannot process all the information, so you miss something, or through tactics, which unfortunately many people in the literature call strategy. The two are not the same. I'm talking about damage containment tactics, decisions that you make when you find that this is becoming too difficult, too much, so I will give up on rendering the information fully, or I will give up on optimum language quality in the output and try to focus on what is essential. So this is also a result of cognitive load when it is too high. My claim is that this happens quite often, and this is based partly on introspection, on personal introspection, and to a large extent on observation, on empirical observation, empirical studies, naturalistic and experimental, with colleagues, when you see what happens. When you ask interpreters whether this happens, when they sometimes feel this is too much, I will give up on doing the maximum, doing a perfect job, they have a problem admitting it. So in a questionnaire, I will say a few words about a questionnaire survey that I launched some time ago. In a survey, they admitted that this happened, but the frequency was not quite clear. Most of them said sometimes. And what I will argue is that some indicators that are used in the literature and that do not find clear-cut results are just not good enough, and I'll explain why. Recently, I gave a talk to doctoral students at Gallaudet University, and when I asked them about that, there was a very funny reaction. Of course, this happens. You will understand a bit later why this is relevant. Now, how do we measure cognitive load? And now we reach perhaps the central part of the discussion or the real issue. If cognitive load takes on relative values, can you measure it? Well, I would say ordinally, in terms of ordinal variables, you can, with the sensitivity and reliability of the methods that remains to be determined. Essentially, on the basis that some tasks are perceived as more effortful than others, and or are correlated with lower performance quality or with certain tactics, including linguistic tactics. There has been some very interesting research from China these past few years that show what happens, excuse me, that show what happens when people face a higher cognitive load. They change syntactic structures, they reduce dependency distance. I can discuss this later if you wish. A few studies are reported in the Syrian Bulletin, which I invite you to read if you have trouble falling asleep at night. In practical terms, perhaps you could compare the effortfulness of two tasks or two conditions as they are perceived, as reported verbally. In other words, people say, yes, I consider this was more difficult than that, and for this or that reason. So this could be a way of classifying cognitive load. But how sensitive is it? How aware of the differences are the interpreters? And if they are, will they report the differences? So that's one possibility. How about comparing errors, omissions, and infelicities under two conditions with higher cognitive load and lower cognitive load? This may be more sensitive, not sure, but there are problems. One problem lies with identifying what are real errors, omissions, and infelicities. It's not so easy at all. And the other point is the resolution, which it's not a very good way of formulating it, but the time at which cognitive load, local cognitive load, instant cognitive load increases is not necessarily the same moment in which you will find the EOIs. The EOIs will come downstream after a while. So this is when you're interested in local cognitive load, because cognitive load is not just an average value, stable value over a speech or a sentence. It varies. Plus, there are problems with these methods. There may be floor effects. If the speech is too easy, you will not be able to compare the difficulty as perceived or EOIs in interpretations, and ceiling effects as well. If both speeches are, or if cognitive load is particularly high in both speeches, then people will just be unable to interpret it correctly, and they will not be able to say where cognitive load is higher and where it is lower. What else? Can you compare the frequency or the amplitude of other indicators of cognitive load? For instance, to what extent do interpreters lag behind the speakers? The number of chunks of information in working memory. I will be talking about that again in a few minutes. A popular strategy, and this is where I think we are making a big mistake, perhaps, by not seeing that this is challenging. People measure the interpreter's cognitive effort, the assumption being that effort is a monotonic function of cognitive load. Monotonic function is just a mathematical term that means that if one increases, the other one increases as well. If one decreases, it decreases the other one as well. So the idea is that if cognitive load increases, cognitive effort increases as well. Okay, how good is that strategy? Again, on the basis of observation in the field and introspection, it is probably okay within a certain range of effort levels. But how about when cognitive load is high? Then cognitive effort may stagnate or even cease. This is something that has been noticed by researchers who used pupil dilation as an indicator of cognitive effort. When the tasks become too difficult, the pupil no longer dilates, but either remains at the same diameter or actually shrinks again. So let us look at a metaphor. I always like to use simple metaphors to try to help me think. When you climb and carry a rucksack, you could say that the load that you carry can be measured, and you can increase it or decrease it. Now, you could have an indicator for the effort, in this case, the physiological effort, not the cognitive effort, that you have to devote in order to climb with a rucksack. The idea being is that if the rucksack is heavier, there's a higher load, so you expect a faster heart rate. So, would you say that if you noticed in the climber a faster heart rate, this means that the rucksack is heavier or that the slope is steeper? Well, this is a bit hasty. Not so fast. If the rucksack is heavier, it is quite possible that the climber will slow down and the heart rate will remain stable. So the indicator of effort will not show what it is supposed to show. And if the heart rate does increase, are you sure this is due to the fact that cognitive load is higher? Or is it perhaps because the climber is already thinking of having a beer at the summit of the mountain? So these are very, very basic problems that you have with all indicators, actually with all scientific tests, including medical tests, by the way. In the literature, many indicators of so-called cognitive load are actually indicators of cognitive effort. They are not indicators of cognitive load directly. They measure the effort. An example, disfluencies, measured, for instance, used by de Franck on an European Parliament corpus. Filled pauses. Okay, let's say that filled pauses express some effort. This is apparently quite well documented in spontaneous speech production. These disfluencies are caused by cognitive effort. Fine. But again, we have a problem with the time of occurrence, which may be distant, at some distance from the time of the occurrence of the trigger, of the place where the high cognitive load occurred. Pupil dilation. This was used by Daniel Kahneman, by Tomula back in the 1990s, by Zaber more recently for interpreting. This is a very sensitive indicator of cognitive effort with a very small latency of about half a second. So it is better when you look at local cognitive effort. But what about load? We don't know. It is promising, but there are limitations. Then you can look at heart rate, blood pressure, activation of specific brain areas, etc. But you cannot assume that there is a high correlation between cognitive load and cognitive effort without checking somehow. And when I read the literature, and I've been reading the literature very systematically, I found some real challenges, some real problems quite frequently. One is that people tend to assume, without checking whether this is indeed the case, a very strong correlation between cognitive effort and cognitive load. They use indicators of cognitive effort as if they were indicators of cognitive load. When I ask people, do you remember cases where you realized that you would not be able to interpret all of the content of a sentence and decided to omit part of the information to save what was essential? Yes or no? When this happens, this would not be captured by cognitive effort indicators because people just give up. But simple verbal statements, if interpreters say or translators say, yes, at that point, this was too much, so I lift it, then this would mean, to me, this would be reliable enough. Again, this has to be checked. But I believe that it may be more reliable than all these physiological indicators that may or may not be sensitive enough, reliable enough, and specific enough. Another type of error that I find in the literature is people make inferences on the basis of a single cognitive effort indicator without analyzing its strengths and weaknesses. There are lots of, when you try to diagnose a disease in medicine, there are many indicators, but you don't say that people have this or that condition just because they have temperature or just because they have one symptom or another symptom. You have to look at all of them. And unless you're quite sure, if you have a marker in a laboratory test, that is indeed, for instance, the existence of an antibody, which has already been tested, then you can use a single indicator and draw conclusions. But this is not the case as regard cognitive effort and cognitive load. And a third problem that I find quite often is that people rely on corpus statistics without checking individual behavior, because there is a lot of high variability in interpreting behavior, which is cognitive behavior. The variability is really very, very high. It's not something like 5%, 10%, 20%, etc. It can vary very often over a whole order of magnitude, from 1 to 10, sometimes more than that. So signals that have small effects can be drowned in the noise, and you do not detect them. So what do I say to people who do empirical research or who wish to do empirical research around the measurement of cognitive load? I tell such students or beginning researchers, don't just measure because somebody else has measured it. Stop and think. First of all, why do you want to measure cognitive load? Do you want to assess the difficulty of a task? Or do you want to find when a task is difficult so as to make it easier? Or determine some way to make it easier? Or are you trying to measure cognitive load so as to know how to select people for a task, people who are capable of performing well on a difficult task? Another question, what levels of cognitive load are you interested in? All levels or high levels only? I mean, a very low level of cognitive load is generally of no interest. A very high level of cognitive load may be of interest and may not be of interest. If you're looking at things that only highly trained people will be able to do, you're interested in high cognitive load levels as well. But if you're looking at things that most people can do, you're more interested in middle of the range cognitive load values. And what level of accuracy is required from these measurements? It's all very nice to have extremely accurate indicators, but very often the question is, will the person be able to perform the task, yes or no? Or will it be slightly better? I mean, there are many levels of accuracy that are possible, and depending on the answers, different methods might be best. And I believe that very often the simplest methods, verbal statements, simple questions, can be better if you take all necessary precautions than the very sophisticated methods, the sophisticated statistics that are used. I say beware of sophistikitis, statistikitis, measureitis, and one-upmanshipitis that are very often found in the field. I think it's interesting to look at properties of effort indicators, look at their sensitivity, selectivity, reliability. We have to think of the meaning of values of effort indicators that are measured. Sometimes you have effort indicators that show that cognitive load is high, but sometimes they just mean that the subject or the person whose cognitive effort was measured has a low level of knowledge, has a low level of skills, or has a low level of motivation. So you have to think of the meaning. I think it would be a good idea to investigate correlations between effort indicators, to select one, a few, or a combination for triangulation. For instance, pupil dilation, filled, unfilled pauses, ear-voice span, etc., retrospective comments, and it would be good to investigate the ranges for which there is good correlation between single effort indicators. Maybe they are very well correlated between a low threshold and a higher threshold, but not beyond or beneath. And investigate correlations between effort indicators and quality performance indicators. I think this is quite central. And for that purpose, you use convenient errors, omission, and infelicities indicators such as names, numbers, and enumerations, which are easy to identify and rather easy to check whether they are errors or not, or omissions. If the correlation is high, the effort indicator may indeed be a good one for cognitive load. So I'm certainly not against using cognitive effort indicators to measure cognitive load, but I think this has to be done very cautiously. Okay, a bit more about the case of interpreting. I'm interested in cognitive load levels that damages performance on the high end. Others might be interested in initial skills for selection of trainees. I believe cognitive load varies throughout interpreting. I'm interested in local cognitive load. Within a speech, even within a sentence, there are places where cognitive load is higher or lower. So it's really important to look at indicators that will give us not an average, but some value that is highly localized in time. Now, as an example, the so-called imported cognitive load hypothesis. Sometimes when interpreters have not finished interpreting a sentence, when the speaker starts formulating the next sentence, the imported load from the previous sentence may affect their processing of the current sentence, which makes sense in terms of cognitive load theory as well, because you still have some information in working memory from the previous sentence. Now, I'm illustrating what I said earlier with examples. Plevets and de Franck used European Parliament corpora, identified disfluencies of the filled form, the filled pause form, which are known to be indicators of cognitive effort in speech production, as I said earlier, and they used them to check for statistically significant correlations between an increase in the number of such pauses in the interpreter's production and various variables. And this is quite problematic in terms of logic. And their conclusion, and I say a few comments about that in Syrian Bullets number 62, it's quite surprising because they didn't find statistically significant correlations. They say there is no such thing as imported cognitive load effect. But when I asked people, as I said earlier on, if they remember cases where having lagged behind the speaker, they were not able to process optimally the current sentence because of the unfinished reformulation of the previous sentence, then almost everyone out of close to 40 answers I got for a survey said, yes, I do remember. How about intersubjective identification of information chunks? This would be a way of measuring directly cognitive load, and I find this quite interesting. It has to be confirmed. This is something that is found in a paper published by Gile and Chai in 2020. It's based on Gile's PhD. She measured information chunks in sentences, and information chunks were actually identified by human assessors, and apparently there was very high intersubjective agreement. I find this very, very interesting because this is simple. It requires a lot of work, yes, but it's simple, it's human, and there's high intersubjective agreement, and we know what we're talking about. What she found was that quality deterioration was found starting with 4 chunks. When there were 4 chunks in working memory that hadn't been interpreted yet, then the output quality deteriorated with errors and omissions. Could this be a good way to measure cognitive load without having to measure cognitive effort? I would really like to see some follow-up on this study and see whether this is confirmed. It's quite interesting. Okay, to summarize and conclude regarding the ideas that I mentioned here. First of all, there is a definite link between a task that is perceived as effortful and something that a construct, namely cognitive load. Now, an effortful task also produces cognitive effort, and cognitive effort can be assessed through indicators. What the relation is between cognitive load and cognitive effort is a bit difficult to say at this point, but at least there is some kind of relationship. And on the high end of cognitive effort, when cognitive effort becomes very, very strong, or perhaps one should say on the high end of cognitive load, we have suboptimal output quality. The quality of the output deteriorates. But output quality also depends on relevant knowledge, on attentional resources, and on cognitive effort. You may have relevant knowledge and attentional resources, but cognitive effort is low. So output quality is low as well, if people are not conscientious. And cognitive effort depends on cognitive load, of course, on a relevant knowledge, on attentional resources, and on motivation, which is not often taken on board. Indicators for output quality, cognitive effort, and cognitive load are linked to each other, but should not be mistaken for each other. Most of them are indicators that are quite distinct. Some measure cognitive efforts, some may measure cognitive load. There is no fixed standard relationship between output quality, cognitive effort, and cognitive load indicators that should be assumed without some thinking and some exploring, empirical exploring. And some indicators can be strongly correlated over a certain range of values, which would make it possible to use them beyond their original function. In other words, if you find that a cognitive effort indicator is very strongly correlated to cognitive load and to output quality for over a certain range, you could use cognitive effort for cognitive load. In interpreting and in learning tasks, cognitive load is probably most interesting to investigators at the high end. In interpreting, high cognitive load is manifest through suboptimal output quality. In interpreting, again, high cognitive load is not necessarily manifest through physiological cognitive effort indicators. We saw the example of pupil dilation, and the same thing would happen with disfluencies. For instance, in the European Parliament, there may well be a norm that says that interpreters have to sound very professional and not show their problems, so you actually inhibit the filled pauses and the problems, the output quality suffers, but you do not show, you do not exhibit a proportional number, proportional frequency of disfluencies. In high cognitive load, Verbal reports, what people say, can be more meaningful than physiological indicators because you would have at the same time the confirmation or refutation of something that you believe is true and some comments that would explain its meaning. Of course, verbal reports are always only reliable to a certain extent, but what I'm saying is that physiological indicators are also reliable to a certain extent only. Sensitive cognitive effort indicators with high time resolutions are of particular interest when studying local cognitive load. Now, there's high variability in cognitive behavior. So depending on the research question, analyzing individual behavior on specific speech segments can be much more efficient in terms of research strategy than conducting group statistics on whole speeches. And this also means that manual analysis can be much more efficient than automated analysis. Again, let us take advantage of technology when it is useful, but let us not forget that very often manual methods, simple methods, traditional methods with a lot of thinking can be just as useful and sometimes more efficient. Now, cognitive load can be manipulated without damaging ecological validity. For instance, by enhancing interpreters' knowledge with preparation. I think it is safe to assume, but this will have to be subject to intersubjective agreement. If people come into a speech or into an interpreting session without any previous knowledge of the speaker, of the stakes, then it's more difficult than if they have had already preparation. So you can compare what happens in terms of indicators of cognitive effort, cognitive knowledge, and output quality under both conditions, with or without preparation. You can also introduce white noise, or increase white noise, or reduce noise, or improve acoustic quality of the source speech, which also probably can be widely accepted as modulating the cognitive load, because it would take more cognitive resources, more attention to actually perceive and analyze the speech. You could change the length of inter-sentence pauses, just giving interpreters some belief. This is what Barranco in Spain did for his PhD a few years ago. And you could do repeat interpreting. You have people interpret a speech once and then interpret it the second time. The second time, it should probably be considered as representing lower cognitive load because people already know what to expect. And when you do that, you can investigate experimentally how does the quality of the output change and what do various cognitive load and cognitive effort indicators show. I think that experiments along such lines would probably help learn much more about the links between the various indicators. A very last point, a terminological point, because of the existence of cognitive load theory, which defines cognitive load as a function of working memory capacity, I wonder if it would not be a good idea to speak more generally not of cognitive load, but perhaps of cognitive pressure, which would make it possible to refer to the intuitive construct and have the same questions, the same logical questions, without necessarily linking it to working memory, which is also a contract and which is also challenged by some cognitive scientists. So this is the end of the ordeal for you, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank God I am not on site, so you cannot throw rotten eggs at me, but you can still do it in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gile, for a very insightful presentation. So now I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have question, can you press the raise hand button below the screen. Okay, Bin Hua.
Yes, thank you very much. Professor Gile, nice to see you again here. I'm Bin Hua from University of Leeds. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
Sorry,
fine.
I don't know how to switch on the video, but I believe my microphone is on. Sorry, I mean, I'm a big fan of your books, both the 1995 version and the revised version. I wonder how you would differentiate between the terminologies in the books. I mean, cognitive capacity, and here the two terms, cognitive load and cognitive efforts or effort.
I'm not sure I understand. Are you asking about the difference between cognitive load and cognitive effort?
Yes, cognitive load, cognitive effort, as well as processing capacity,
No,
which I believe was the term.
no. Processing capacity, I would now tend to call attentional resources. Having read much since the very first version of my effort models, I think attentional resources is better. Processing capacity was a sort of metaphor, but processing the attentional resources are what you draw on in order to devote some effort to perform a task which involves cognitive load. So to me, the relationship is quite clear.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have next questions. Anne Catherine Gishoff.
Yes, please.
You didn't hear me because I didn't switch my audio on. Sorry for that.
That makes sense, yes.
Also, I don't know whether you can actually see me because I haven't. Anyways, doesn't matter so much. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned the difficulty that we cannot observe so much a distinction between cognitive load and cognitive effort because, while the tasks we use are mostly of moderate difficulty, where effort would kind of adapt to the load that is needed. So implicitly of what I understood was a little bit a suggestion to maybe try more extreme tasks, maybe something that is extremely simple, something else that is extremely difficult. My question actually is another one. I'm currently in Forlich because I was attending the ICTIC conference, and Bart de Frank, whom you mentioned also, suggested that we should also look at strategies that are used by interpreters to compensate for high load. Do you think that the use of those strategies increase cognitive effort to reduce cognitive load, or how would you describe the relationship?
No, okay, thank you for your two questions. First of all, no, I'm not saying that we should look at extreme values. I think we need to understand conceptually that there's a difference between cognitive load and cognitive effort. Cognitive load is something that would require theoretically more effort because it is more difficult. And cognitive effort is what you actually devote to it. And I'm saying that the relationship between the two is not necessarily as straightforward as people tend to believe, especially when you reach high levels of cognitive load. Then very often in actual practice, people stop devoting more cognitive effort because they just give up. So this is one thing. It has nothing to do with looking at extreme cases. This is just a minor correction. Now, tactics that are used. I don't use strategies. I've explained many times why. I think, yes, tactics should be indeed looked at as well. Tactics are part, and this is also something that I mentioned in the PowerPoint. tactics are one way of reacting to cognitive load. And some tactics will reduce cognitive load, and many tactics, I think, are supposed or assumed by colleagues to reduce cognitive load and actually to be selected so as to reduce cognitive load. But some of them may actually add to cognitive load. For instance, if you choose to explain something just to make sure that people understand in the target language, if you use the word Gemütlichkeit and you want people to really understand what it is and you devote a few seconds to explain what it is, meanwhile, what will happen is that you will lag behind. And if you lag behind, working memory will have accumulated more information. And that means that later it will increase cognitive load. This will be imported load. So I don't think it's as simple and all that. You really have to think, to me, you have to think logically, always logically, look at the meaning of things, the relationship between various entities, not schematically, not just formally. I hope this has answered your question to some extent.
Thank you very much. And I agree with you that the relationship is anything but simple.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions? Yes, Lee?
I am very interested in you mentioned about some research talk about the chunking method. For me, that was something I think is there's really bridge between the practical field and the research field. Chunking has been a long-established method for quite times. And I remember when I was taking the class, I made a slide, just try to just say in practice how to trunk the long sentence into the shorter one. But the trunking is kind of a strategy, and it's a practical strategy. But there is a lot of the impact on the quality of output. Because for the long sentence, I'm really very impressed by the you mentioned about the type of the for trunk in the sentence. So because when you talk about the output quality, there's one thing is from information wide or is from the quality of the sentence. Because if you talk about the quality of the sentence, there's trunking has a huge impact on that. If for your long sentences, we all know I am a Chinese. Chinese and English, the sentence order is quite different. So if the sentence is longer than 2-3 chunks, a lot of times you will find a simultaneous interpreter where the interpret the sentence like in the English way or in original language way, source language in the way of source language, but not in the way of the target language because the limitation on the trunking. And also, when you talk about the yeah, sometimes it's kind of an effort because when you try to do the trunking, a lot of time you do the trunking is one thing. Another thing is you also try to be organized in your brain so you can really recall it. So it is kind of an effort when you have some song, because they were trying to organize their thought, and it's a kind of a technical way because they try to flip order. Because in order for the target language sounds more natural, a lot of times that's really dependent on the interpreter. They automatically do flip order on the trunking, not on the different chunks, but not just say that as the way it is. So I think there is a lot of the thing to consider about. But I also, one more thing make me think about was when you talk about cognitive load, it can help make me think about there's English, there's a word called I think called readability. Talk about the complexity of the the vocabulary and the sentence structure. And so I also think about is that any relation between these two or not? And I think that's something I'm not sure has anyone considered it or not.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments.
Okay. Dr. Gile, I have questions, if I may.
Please do, please ask a question.
Yes. You said that cognitive load, when it increases, doesn't always correlate with also increases in cognitive effort, because the person might just give up when there is higher cognitive load. So I was wondering, is there a way to measure that? For example, with retrospective verbal methods, or I was thinking about, what do you think about the self rating assessment that is commonly used for measuring cognitive load in cognitive psychology, the one that was used by Ayres in 2006? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think that perhaps the question will, the answers or beginnings of an answer will come through triangulation. I think that, as I tried to explain in my presentation, my talk, I think you need to look at more than one indicator. And I definitely believe that retrospection helps. I think we have to be very careful with retrospection for reasons that are well known to scientists, that have been known for a long, long time, because not everything is reliable. But not everything is reliable in physiological terms either. The measurements may be reliable, but the reasons are more difficult to find. So what happens when cognitive load increases? I think we should look at various factors, and I think that it's becoming common now to combine measurements of objective indicators with retrospection and see whether they say the same thing or something convergent, or whether one contradicts the other. Plus, of course, the assessment of quality. And as Dr. Lee said, output quality means, when I talk about errors, omissions, and infelicities, I mean language as well, definitely. There has been, for instance, Ella Vermeyer from South Africa found that interpreters who work into Zulu use Zulu sign language in a certain way, using the Zulu sign language, the standard signs. But when the going gets rough, then sometimes they will use English words instead, rather than the Zulu words. And this is not an error, but this would be an infelicity. So definitely, yes, you look at output quality in terms of everything. You could look at verbal content, at language quality, at informational content, at prosody. You could look at all sorts of indicators. And then you might get closer to a better understanding of the relationship between cognitive effort and cognitive load.
So if there's an example, would, for example, self-rating or retrospective method plus output quality analysis and ear voice span would suffice to say we have good sound triangulation method?
Well, it would depend on the specific research questions that you have.
Okay, thank you. We have one question From Hussam. Please, Hussam.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear me, but
Yes, yes. Your voice is
yes.
clear. Yes,
Okay.
please.
So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I just have a question about like an hypothetical situation. Say that like in an interpreting situation, an experienced interpreter is interpreting something that is like it should be an automatic operation for them. Like I assume low cognitive load, but this segment of interpreting goes against for some reason it goes against the interpreter's opinion, beliefs, or whatever. So in that case, the interpreter pauses, they stop, they think, and so in this situation, is this an example of a low cognitive load but high cognitive effort for the interpreter? And if this happens, like in a study or in a situation, how could that be explained?
Okay, no, I think that the speech as a whole, because of the complexity of the situation, the cognitive load gets to be high. It gets to be high because the interpreter pauses and has to think about it. And while the interpreter thinks about it, the information is still in working memory. And the interpreter has to think, what do I do with information? Do I render it as it was expressed? Do I not do this? Do I change it or whatever? And all of this requires attention. So the cognitive load gets high, even though there's no difficulty in the content or the language of the speech itself. Plus, what happens is that because if you pause for a second or two, by that time the speaker has advanced generally. So you will have more information of the current sentence, which is added to what you haven't decided to do yet with from the previous sentence. So what will happen is the next part of the speech, right after the pause, after the trigger, will become a higher cognitive load segment than the previous one. Even though the speech is very easy, the text is easy, the ideas are easy, the speaker is clear, etc. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So the tactics may increase cognitive load, they may decrease cognitive load. And this is one thing that interpreters have to do, sign language interpreters have to do, because very often they are expected by the deaf community to speak in iconic language. In other words, with as little interference as possible. Or maybe you are a sign language interpreter, are you?
No.
No, okay. So they are expected, there's a norm, the linguistic norm, that you should express things iconically and not with the English words, not just do a sentence that sounds like English in, for instance, American Sign Language or Indonesian Sign Language or whatever. But when they use a tactic to take a very simple sentence in English, say, and turn it into something iconic, they have to think of a whole setting, a whole imaginary setting that they have to place in what is called signing space. And all of this takes time, and all of this takes creativity. And by the time they do it, they have produced an iconically okay output, but they have lost information because their working memory is saturated. So they really have to find the best tactic under the circumstances and weigh the pros and cons every time.
Got it, Dr. G. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
I saw a written question
Yes.
about the difference between tactics and strategies. Just very rapidly, I have written about it, and if the person who asked the question wants me to, he or she can write to me, and I will send it. But basically, tactics are decisions and followed by actions that are spurred on by something that just happened. And strategies are those that have some preparation, some planning. And the reason why I make a difference between the two is that the way they are acquired and the way they are used in cognitive terms can be very, very different. You can prepare for strategies. You cannot prepare for tactics. Tactics depend on things that you do immediately. So this depends on cognitive resources at a certain point in time, which is not the case of strategies. But I mean, the persons who want to have more information on that can write to me and I will send information. I don't want to take up too much time.
Okay. If the time is actually it's up, so do we give more questions? One more questions, or if there's anyone more? No? So I guess that's it for today. Thank you very much, Dr. Gile, for very, very insightful presentations. Thank you very much all for attending this session. So hope to see you again for the next translation colloquium next month. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you for your patience. Take an aspirin and go home. Bye-bye.
Bye.